everyone, welcome to this very special Halloween episode of Royal News Network. My name is Brittany and today I'm going to be sharing with you guys a bit of the historic inspiration for the fictional character we all know today as Dracula, and how vampires really come from very much two historical figures, both of whom were actually royals. So yes, royalty is the reason we have Twilight and Blade and so many other stories related to vampires. We can thank royalty for that. Isn't that lovely? Although both of the stories are terrible, and I'll really only be focusing on one. She's actually the inspiration for my medieval outfit today. But we're going to be sharing with you guys a bit about Elizabeth Bathory. She was nicknamed the Blood Countess. She's known for being one of the world's first documented serial killers. And she was a woman who killed young girls, basically. It's a really pretty horrific story. Although there are some who do think that she actually did not kill anybody, perhaps. So I will share with you guys a bit of the historical record I found from reading this book, and I'll let you guys let me know in the comments below after you get to the end. Do you think she really did it or not? But if you guys haven't been here to Royal News Network before, hello, my name is Brittany, and on this channel we talk about everything related to royals pretty much. So I do some commentary on the breaking news stories, a bit of gossip. I also do television shows and movies, and today is like my first official history specific episode. I'm so thrilled about it. I was hoping to get it done yesterday because that would have made more sense, but I so enjoyed actually reading and learning more about this historical character that I was just like, I just kept reading and I was like, okay, I just really wanted to know, because I wanted to give you guys the best information possible, because really honestly in English it appears there's only really one or two decent books about Elizabeth. And I just was reading through this story, and at first I remember when I was first reading this book about her, it mentioned that she was not responsible for all the charges set against her, and I was like, ooh, well that is interesting, but you know, I don't know, like, because kind of the fun is the story, and if the story's not true then all goes by the wayside. But as I started reading, man alive, is the history more fascinating than the legend? It really is. And I feel like it's almost always the case. So hopefully we will be able to do more videos like this. So if you really enjoyed this content, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed as well, please do. And without further ado, let's actually talk about a little bit of the royals of today. So Catherine, the Princess of Wales, recently did a video for Action on Addiction. So if you guys want to take a listen to this, go ahead and watch here. All right, I love how that is one of her patronages she got when she first got married, and that she's still continuing to fight on behalf of those struggling with addiction. And then we also have King Willem Alexander and Queen Maxima of the Netherlands. They are currently in Greece on an official state visit, and I love her first outfit. It will definitely be on my list this week. So I do cover royal fashion, but I do it on Royal Fashion News. So I review and pick my top 5 best and worst looks of the week. So Maxima will definitely be on my best list, but her second dress I'm not so sure about. So guys, go ahead and take a look at a couple of pictures here in addition to some video as well. I kind of love her dress, and I'm not sure about her dress. So guys, let me know what you think. Okay, we also have Crown Prince Frederick and Crown Princess Mary. They are in Vietnam for an official visit, and apparently Crown Prince Frederick, his father Henrik, used to live there. So Henrik was not actually born the monarch of Denmark like his mother was. So Henrik was actually married into the monarchy. So he apparently lived in Vietnam for a period of time, and so him and his wife are there doing an official tour, and they took a couple pictures outside his home. So I just thought that was kind of a cool little tidbit. But guys, back to the history lesson of today. Well, I shouldn't say history lesson, because I know some people tune out when they hear history, but this is actually really interesting. I promise. And I thought it was really fascinating because as I was reading through it, I was very struck by how you kind of feel those elements of what we know about modern crime and modern criminals and serial killers. Basically, you see it in Elizabeth. But I do have to say again, some people actually think it was a giant conspiracy to frame her in order because she was a woman of significant power. So who was Elizabeth Bathory? So she was born into the Bathory family. Actually, both her mother and her father both came from different sides of the Bathory family. So they were distantly related to each other, but they weren't that close either. They weren't like first cousins. There was a degree of separation. So she came up, she was apparently very, very intelligent. She could read and write in multiple languages, which was actually pretty rare at the time. She could read and write in Greek, Hungarian, Latin, and German. In addition, she also, I believe, knew a bit of the Slovenian language, maybe, perhaps. I may be misspeaking there. But she was a very intelligent woman, and she was born on August 7th, 1560 in what is now Hungary. So included in her line were several princes, a cardinal, which was a big deal back in the time. If you're related to somebody from the Catholic Church, especially a cardinal, that's a pretty big deal. And she was also related to the King of Poland. That was her uncle at one point. So Elizabeth has this very, very, very distinguished line. Yet at the same time, most of the Bathorys were kind of ignored throughout history or kind of sidelined after her little escapades. And she really has become synonymous with the woman trying to seek out her youth and really vampires. She's Vlad the Impaler, who was one of her contemporaries. He was a little bit older than she was. So Vlad the Impaler, who was really the true historic inspiration for Dracula. He was actually Vlad of Dracul. He was the Prince of Wallachia, which is in Transylvania. And actually, Elizabeth also has a lot of connections to Transylvania. Had homes there and visited there quite a bit, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of connections between the two of them, which makes them so fascinating to me, that these two figures who very much are steeped, their legends are steeped in blood and these rumors of vampires and those sorts of things, that they both came from basically the same region and around the same time period. Now, he was born actually about 100 years earlier than she was. He was born in 1431 and died, was assassinated in 1476. And why was he named Vlad the Impaler? Because he liked to impale people. And this should go without saying, but I just should repeat it anyways. We will be talking about some very serious things here and things that happen in history that include torture, death, and mutilation of adults and children. So if that's something that is very difficult for you to hear, obviously, you make your own discretion on those situations, and I will share with you a bit when I'm going to kind of go over some of those details. So maybe that's something that if you decide, I don't really want to hear about it, I totally get it. But living back in those times, it was brutal. It was very, very brutal. So Vlad the Impaler, he was known for impaling people. That's how he got his name. Now, it's interesting because like Elizabeth, his death count, I believe, was inflated because as time got on and you were somebody who was connected with this darkness, your legend grows, and they sometimes use this legend. Obviously, the victors write history, and sometimes they make you more terrifying than you actually were because it fits their narrative. So Vlad, he supposedly impaled a ton of people. Impaling is somewhat similar to crucifixion in the way that there's a big stick in the ground with a pointed edge, and either via certain body cavities, you are set on it and your body weight basically shoves the stick through you. Sounds like an awful way to die. Sounds truly, truly horrid. And the legend with Vlad is that he would basically sit and eat dinner and just basically drink the blood of his victims who are being impaled. That was the legend of Vlad. So he was 100 years before Elizabeth's time, and what they were dealing with, which was similar, which deeply impacted Elizabeth's life, was the incursion of the Ottoman Turks. So the Ottoman Turks were constantly going through this region trying to push further into Europe. And so it would be required by those who were serving the Hapsburg Empire in Austria and all these smaller little kingdoms to fight against the Ottoman Turks. Vlad the Impaler was very much known for that. There's a story that some Ottoman Turks came to deal with him in some form or another, and they refused to take off their turbans, so he nailed their turbans on their heads and sent them on their way. I don't think they survived that. But I actually didn't get to read a book detailing Vlad because I don't want to come at you guys with basically stories that are more steeped in legend than they are in fact. So I actually read, or kind of fastly skimmed, since I don't have a ton of time, a book about Elizabeth yesterday. And I was just, again, utterly fascinated by who she was and her history. So Elizabeth, legend of Elizabeth, and perhaps I should have led with this. So allegedly, Elizabeth bathed in the blood of her virginal victims. And so at the highest estimate, she's estimated to kill 650 people. And so she would kill these girls, bathe in their blood in order to preserve her youth. That was the legend. And people had given them their daughters because at some point she was a noblewoman, so she said she could train them up and those sorts of things, and so they gave them her daughters, and all these things happened, and she was eventually imprisoned and died. So that is Elizabeth's story. But as they say, fact is more interesting than fiction, and I feel like this definitely is the case here. So like I said earlier, Elizabeth was born in 1560, and she was a part of the Bathory family, and so she was a woman of significant power and influence, and so she was married to another family that had similar ties, although they were not quite as well established because the Bathory family went back centuries, but they did have a significant amount of money. So her husband, Frederick, and she was 11 when she became engaged to him, and he was a count. So in that time period, obviously marriages were dynastic decisions. They were ambassadorial ships. You did not get to choose who you married. You married a specific person because it fit your family's, your country's dynastic goals, and it formed alliances. So that's why those are generally the people who you marry. So it's not usually for love. And Elizabeth, although she had a fantastic upbringing, she was very intelligent, she also had seizures, it sounds like, and perhaps suffered from epilepsy. And she was prone to sometimes fits of rage. So there are some questions about whether there was some mental health issue that she was dealing with, or was it within her family. However, when she was young, she ended up marrying Frederick, and she ended up going to live in his castle quite young, because even before they were married, part of the purpose is to help these girls understand these huge homes they had to manage, because that's a huge responsibility, is to manage these homes. Even today, that's a big, big job. And we say it's easy and it takes $300 million to do the upkeep on Buckingham Palace, and people roll their eyes and go, oh, that's such an insane amount of money. But I mean, it really is, but it also isn't, because those type of homes are very, very difficult to maintain because of their how big they are, how big their footprint is. Actually, living in Buckingham Palace isn't that nice to a certain extent, because it's kind of drafty, it's moldy, it has cracks and those sorts of things. And that's what people deal with in a lot of these manor houses, because the upkeep is so expensive and so difficult, because you're dealing with very old masonry, and that to come in and just like fix it up like we do here in the States is very, very different. So Elizabeth came in and she started learning how to manage her husband's estates and her estates that she would inherit as well from her own family. And there are rumors that because of that, she was perhaps trained in some ways to inflicts some sort of torture on her servants by her mother-in-law, but that is basically seen as untrue, as her mother-in-law died before Elizabeth got there. So again, let's put down that rumor. There's another rumor about Elizabeth's childhood and just warning, this is gruesome, but apparently the legend is that she saw somebody being sewn into the body of a horse, a person of gypsy descent. And the legend is that she saw this happen and she laughed. However, basically everybody agrees that, well, horses were valued more than peasants were, because horses were incredibly expensive and you needed to get them to get places, so they were a very important part of your life. So it's doubtful that unless the horse was already dead or dying that they would even do something like this. And it just doesn't make a ton of sense. They don't have a ton of evidence that this was done routinely. So most likely that little bit of the legend, if you've heard that, is probably not true. But as Elizabeth kind of grew up and she eventually married her husband, what's interesting is that because of his connection to the Hapsburg crown and everything, he decided he was going to form up a series of troops and go off and fight the Ottoman Turks. So he spent the good first 10 years or so of their marriage at war, because they actually didn't have kids the first 10 years of their marriage. So he was off fighting. As I was reading, what I really kind of glommed onto and made a lot of sense to me, given that we knew Vlad, who also fought the Ottoman Turks, was pretty violent, that apparently Frederick learned a lot on the battlefield. And those were things he brought home. So some of the thoughts are perhaps is that Elizabeth first experienced brutality from her own husband, and then she ended up pursuing and doing those same things to her servants. But it kind of gets deeper than that, because apparently Frederick would actually teach her torture techniques he learned while fighting the Ottoman Turks. She also learned some additional techniques apparently from this woman named Anna. And Anna was really the one who kind of taught her, and then Frederick was also teaching her these various things as well. And one of them was actually to put oiled paper between the toes of these young girls that were there serving Elizabeth and light them on fire. So Elizabeth apparently at some point, we're not sure exactly when, but was sometime after the beginning of her marriage, got this penchant for torturing, oftentimes and most times to death, her young female servants. So these girls were usually between the ages of 10 and 14. So these were young girls, usually peasant girls, who were there to serve Elizabeth. And yet at some point she would attack them in some way. She would, put needles under their fingers. She would burn them. She would bite them, like bite pieces of flesh off sometimes. And this was something that she started, and she had 4 co-conspirators to help her in addition to Anna. So Anna was the one who kind of taught her some additional techniques, and then she had these 4 conspirators who were really kind of almost her death squad, basically, who would help her torture these young girls. Some of the things that she would do, for example, is obviously it's in a region that's very cold. So at some point she would actually, there was a girl, and the story is that she had complained either about being cold or wanting something to drink or something like that. And so Elizabeth told her, well, go out into the stream into your shoulders and we'll pour more cold water on you. You'll be naked. And then basically she died of exposure. Another girl was reportedly had stolen a coin. So what Elizabeth did is she heated up the coin and scalded the young girl with it. So Elizabeth's torture usually took kind of a reactive or kind of damaging effect. She would kind of twist your desires back on you to a certain extent. And she had a steady crop of victims because she did need people to help her. And apparently at some point she kind of created this room in her castle where only certain people, usually only the 4 conspirators, were allowed to come in, and this is where most of the torture would take place. And these rumors, it took a bit for these rumors to start, but they started getting at the church body after body after body of these young girls. And the preacher's like, what the heck is going on here? And they're like, well, she died of cholera. And he's like, I'm not sure I totally buy that. And they would come to with usually already sealed within a coffin, so that way they couldn't be opened and examined. And it was very meticulous what Elizabeth and her team had done at this point. It was very much a serial killer at the start, where they're very kind of meticulous in how they're managing it. And then again, she would have her husband come home and he would say, oh, I learned these other things on the front line, honey, let me teach you. Do I know why? No, nobody knows why that is. But I will say that I was reading, or one of the people in my cohort at grad school had been reading this book about basically how the American soldiers that were fighting on the Pacific, by osmosis, because the Japanese were so brutal in that conflict, they escalated their brutality, because usually everybody kind of descends to the lowest denominator in terms of violence. So you can't be the side that's being very chivalrous while this other side's being very brutal. At some point you all descend to the same level, because that's the only way you can survive. So the fighting between basically the Europeans in this region and the Ottoman Turks was apparently very brutal, because we see this again through Vlad. And so we have this here in Elizabeth too, because even though it's 100 years later, they're still fighting the same war in many ways, and they're still using the same techniques, or they've actually increased or actually made the techniques better. Because torture at this time had become a way to get confessions out of people, had become very much a mainstay kind of after the Inquisition, that this had become something that was very appropriate. However, what was interesting is that Frederick, he did not torture and kill. I mean, I think he did probably to a certain extent torture the men who were under his employ, but he did not kill them, whereas Elizabeth was. And you got to think as well, there was a very much a separation between the sexes. So only women would help Elizabeth dress. So she had all these women who needed to help her dress and those sorts of things, and that included these girls. Apparently, if you were older, you were really outside of Elizabeth's wrath, but she really did target these young girls that came to her. And this became something that was very much whenever she would move places, the rumors would start, and or people would actually hear screaming from the palace or the castle or wherever she was staying. I shouldn't say palace, but wherever castle she was staying at, people would hear it. Apparently even she was in Vienna and monks could hear the screaming. And it was just something at the time because Elizabeth's husband, he was very much a national hero. He was very, very powerful on the battlefield. So because of his power and influence, and he was funding a lot of this war effort for the Hapsburgs. So the Habsburgs were in his debt. So they had absolutely no reason to attack him or investigate what was going on with his wife. In addition, peasants, unfortunately, their lives weren't worth much, so nobody was really focusing too much on what was going on. But it seemed like there was a decent amount of rumors going on that wherever Elizabeth went, there were bodies and there were screams of women who were basically, or young girls that were basically tortured to death. And this was something, again, that she was quite consistent at. And she had her little conspirators and everybody kind of did it. And again, she would, you know, a lot of it sounded like it was with needles and it just sounded terrible. So this is one story. And this was why one of the men who did eventually share what he had seen, reportedly, he said, the girl was accused of sewing too slowly or making long or clumsy stitches, was stripped naked and made to stand before the Countess. The Countess held either an iron bar or a heavy cudgel in her hands as she paraded past the shivering, sobbing servant. Hold out your hand, she commanded. Wincing, the girl obeyed, only to have her hand struck hard. If she screamed and pulled her hand back, the Countess would demand, hold out your hand and keep it out. If the girl shook her head or begged for mercy, the Countess would fly into a rage and pummel her. Eventually, the hands and fingernails would be smashed and beaten repeatedly until they became swollen, infected, and broken. The lady then threw needle, thread, and fabric at the girl. So you whore. Unable to raise her hand or move the broken fingers, the sobbing girl cried for mercy. The Countess now turned to Desio and her attendants who were standing nearby. Desio was the one giving this testimony. What a useless, spoiled horse she is. She can't even sew. And then, in a rage, she began shoving the needle into the girl's arm repeatedly, straight up to her shoulder. When the girl tried to crawl away, the Countess immediately went over for her whip or crock, flogging her over and over. This also tended to happen around Elizabeth during times of stress. If she was particularly stressed, these torture instincts that she had developed just grew and grew due to the stress of the social situation she was under. And it really was magnified when her killing spree really took on a life of its own, was after the death of her husband. Because once he died, the protection and money he was getting her through all these conquests he was doing in these raids he was doing against the Ottoman Turks really meant that her money was severely diminished. And she was asking for the money her husband was owed by the Hapsburg monarchy. And they, at this point, were basically refusing to give her this money. So she was a woman in her 40s. She was vulnerable without her husband. She had a lot of land, but she didn't have a lot of cash. And at the time, to fund all these war efforts, they were dealing with really high inflation like we are now. In addition, they were being forced to pay these exorbitant taxes. So Elizabeth's paying these exorbitant taxes to the king, who's owes her money, and she's not getting what she's owed. And while she has all these properties and all these physical possessions, she's having a harder and harder time offloading them. And so due to all these things going on in her life, she was very much, I feel like, stressed. Now, doesn't diminish what she did at all, but just trying to explain. She was dealing with this very, very stressful time in her life. And so apparently after the death of her husband, her killing started to increase dramatically. So there were strange accounts and rumors of the Countess torturing her servants' girls. The accounts of Elizabeth torturing her servant girls continued. So this was something, again, that just carried on around Elizabeth. Wherever she went, these rumors followed. And generally, that's probably a good indication they're probably kind of true. People don't generally make up horrific things about somebody unless they have a particular reason, but I will get back to that. So this says, and this is from a book I read about the Countess, it says a pattern had clearly emerged by now. While Elizabeth made high-profile public appearances, typically of the nobility, they were unusually taxing on her psychologically, particularly in her later years. Accounts of her torturing and murdering are frequently linked to times when she had either to make a trip or receive visitors socially. The more uncomfortable the visit or social engagement, the worse the fate inflicted upon her victims. So as these rumors grew, it was something where it was just kind of becoming harder and harder to ignore, especially when Elizabeth opened up her home basically as a finishing school. So she told the young nobility, bring your daughters to me. I will help raise them in the right way, or not really raise them. I will train them up in the right way of noble women. So people would send their girls there and then they didn't get them back. And apparently she went through all of those girls who were sent to her very quickly, to the point where it's like they were starting to really run out of people, because everywhere Elizabeth went, this rumor gained more and more ground, and especially in places where it's pronounced, I think, Katish, that in this area, people knew she had a castle there, and people knew about this and really stopped sending their daughters to her. At some point, this became well known enough. There were people like, we're going to take 2 giant steps back. And so you say, Elizabeth, we're good. we're really, really good. Thank you. So people stopped sending their daughters to her, and it was becoming more and more challenging. They were having to go further and further away from the castle to try to bring victims back in, because people were kind of wising up to her operation. But like any serial killer, she needed more victims. So she just was constantly searching more and more girls to basically torture and kill. So at some point, eventually, this did become to the attention of the king, and it was fortuitous for him, because this rumor fit in well, because if he could play his cards right, in addition to eliminating his debt to the Bathory, Elizabeth Bathory, he also could actually take some of her land and possessions if he played his cards right. Well, I guess Elizabeth at some point had become aware that there was this investigation brewing. So she had created this will which eliminated the ability of the king to take some of her possessions. She was eventually arrested on December 29th, 1610. Now there's some debate on actually what they found when they arrested her. According to most reports, she was actually eating dinner and somebody else was torturing one of her 4 cohorts. Because her original Anna, who had taught her some of the torture techniques, had passed away at this point. She had died. So she did have the original 4 circle, and they were killing this other girl. And they found another body on the property, and they kept uncovering more and more bodies. Because eventually what happened is, as we know with serial killers, if you've ever watched, you know, like something like Criminal Minds or something, as the longer the serial killer goes, at some point they may start to devolve. And this is what was happening with Elizabeth. She started getting really, really sloppy. And they were running out of places to put the bodies, because the church wasn't taking them, because the church was like, hey, I know something's hinky going on here. I'm not totally buying this anymore. I'm not going to give them a Christian burial. So, you know, let us know what's going on. And so they ended up burying them on the property in the Katish castle. They ended up burying them there. They ended up throwing some of the bodies off the side of the castle, and people catch on when you start throwing bodies off side castles, and there's like no war going on. So people were aware of something going on. So they eventually did arrest her, and they took her 4 cohorts, and they started to torture them to get information. And again, this was standard practice at the time. So they eventually did get confessions out of them, and apparently 300 other people came out and witnessed and shared about the brutality they had heard about Elizabeth. Now, this is a caveat. Nobody actually on the record, except for perhaps her cohorts, can actually testify that they saw Elizabeth personally torturing somebody. Most of those people were not available. They heard it secondhand, or they lost somebody, or they didn't get somebody back, or they had heard the stories. However, I will say 300 people, even at that time, that's a lot of people to come out and say, hey, we knew something hinky was going on. And again, you have to think as well, this whole rumor, this whole thing, it really benefits the king, because he can say, wipe his hands and go, we just won't worry about Elizabeth anymore. She has her own problems, and I'll just take all her money and her properties, and it'll all be good. So they started this trial, and they had the testimony of these 4 compatriots, and these 4 compatriots were eventually convicted. 2 of them, so there were 3 women and 1 kind of young teenage boy. He was probably maybe at the most 20, 21. He was very young. So he was involved in all this. So 2 of the older women, they were eventually actually deemed to be executed, and their fingers were apparently supposed to be torn out with hot pinchers, and then they would be thrown into a fire. So the first one they started doing it, she passed out, as I imagine anybody would. And so I think they did actually kill her before they threw her in. The other one fainted in the process. They brought her over, they pulled some of her fingers and then tossed her into the fire. And the young boy, because he was young, although he did participate in it, he was beheaded, which was considered actually merciful because it was a quick death. Now, granted, if the beheader missed, it could not be a quick death, but it's probably faster and probably less than maybe what those women experienced. It's unclear. But the other woman, she was eventually, because she was actually picked on by some of the cohort itself, and she actually did try to help some of the girls where she could, she was actually stayed in prison. And so if somebody came out with stronger testimony against her, they would go ahead and release her or have a new trial for her. So the thought is she kind of disappears from the history books after that. The thought is either she was let out or she eventually died in prison. We're unsure which. There was actually, so they found at least one body and one survivor at the castle when Elizabeth was arrested. And according to the reports, this girl, her name was Anna. She was taken to the nearby town and treated there by the town barber, i.e. surgeon, Thomas. Anna was then taken back to the home of her widowed mother. Anna's hand had been cut to pieces and the flesh gouged out on both sides of her shoulders and buttocks. She remained bedridden for over 2 months. The local records indicate because of this treatment, she received 56 guilders and 15 pounds of wheat, guaranteed by the measure, from the administrator of the Kashish, the command of the illustrious Lord Palatine. After her recovery, she and her mother were given a small farm in Kashish as a free property. And Elizabeth herself, so while this trial was going on, she was basically under house arrest at her castle, but the idea is that she was able to move around somewhat, and she perhaps did leave the castle a time or two, but she was under house arrest. And because she had left in her will her properties and everything to her children, there wasn't as much for the Hapsburgs to gain by pulling this arrest to her, although they did eliminate their debts. So it was determined that Elizabeth should basically be imprisoned for the rest of her life. And they actually did it in, you could almost say, somewhat of a cruel way. So Gregory Thurzo, who caught Elizabeth, he said, "You, Elizabeth, are like a wild animal. You are in the last months of your life. You do not deserve to breathe the air of the earth or see the light of the Lord. You shall disappear from this world and never reappear in it again, as the shadows envelop you. May you find time to repent your bestial life. I hereby condemn you, Lady of Kashish, to lifelong imprisonment in your own castle." So what they ended up doing to Elizabeth is they actually boarded her up in a room. So they literally bricked up the walls in her room and had this little sliver where they could give her food, water, and kind of relieve her of her excrement. So this is how Elizabeth spent the last couple years of her life. She died in 1614, and apparently because she was such actually a prolific writer, pretty much because she did actually know how to write, that once she ran out of parchment, she started to write on the walls. So she was very much confined, and she was reviled to the point where we don't actually even know where she's buried, because she was initially buried in Kashish where her castle was, but they ended up supposedly moving her to the Bathory family crypt. However, when this crypt was opened in the 1990s, wouldn't you know it, she's not there. So we're not sure actually where she is. And in many ways, the Bathory name kind of became synonymous with death in those communities. So, but how did this vampire myth come to be? So apparently when some of the records of this initial trial were revealed, it kind of got out that a Jesuit priest had made this illusion that she kind of bathed in the blood, and somehow this became where she was actually bathing in blood. And it's one of those things where it just kind of kept growing and growing and growing. Became known as the Blood Countess. And her history and this story of her is really fascinating because, again, you kind of see those echoes of a serial killer. And she was in many ways a modern woman. She ran her own household. She did have children, but she had them later in life, later than most women. She, managed all these estates after her husband. She went to petition the king. So she was very much this woman of the world. So that she had this deeply evil side to her is something we've seen in our own serial killers. Ted Bundy could be very, very charming, and yet he could also be utterly, utterly evil. So you had this kind of thing where she was actually able to manage an upper society pretty well. But she also did have this truly depraved side of her. And again, torturing and being abusive towards your servants wasn't necessarily outside the realm of what most people experienced at the time. Now, you could make the argument, though, that the entire story of these, and here's the estimate. So the estimates for her death toll are a couple hundred to 650. Now, I would say, based on the evidence, I would say her cohort said, you know, maybe 50, 30, something like that. But her cohort had the incentive, as we know. They were implicated in her crimes. So what do? You minimize the crimes. Other estimates put it at 1 to 200, which I think sounds accurate. The 650 number was one witness statement from one girl. She said the 650, but I think the 100 to 200, given the time span, which was over a couple decades, and probably the access she had to a lot of young women, because they also had this disparity between the sexes because they had so many men fighting and dying against the Ottoman Turks that there was actually more women than men. So there wasn't like there was this clamoring from young men for an equal clamoring between the two sexes. So there were a lot of girls with time on their hands who needed something to do, needed a skill, and going to a noble woman's house like this and learning these skills was actually a great coup. This could be great for your future, great for your family. So Elizabeth had a strong stock of victims to pull from until the point where people were kind of figuring out what was going on, or they knew something bad was going on, and they were less likely and less inclined to actually give up their daughters to her. Now, you could say this whole story about her and the torture and everything, even though there were 600 or 300 witnesses, that was all made up by the Habsburgs to eliminate their debt and eliminate their financial obligations to Elizabeth. Now, I could totally, there is a argument to be made for that, because obviously at some point if you want to get rid of this person because she's a thorn in your side, which Elizabeth was, she was a powerful woman, she was a wealthy woman, and they were indebted to her. They needed a way to eliminate her so they could remove this obstacle in their minds. However, I would say that making up this story is probably a little much. They actually there was incentive because she was funding some of the rebellion effort against the king. It would actually have been much better and much more logical for them to actually attack her on grounds of treason. That's what they could have attacked her on, or something else. But to attack her on this, I feel like maybe you can make a case of a couple, but how many people they got to testify? Even at that time, 300 testimonies, that's a lot. And the stories were remarkably consistent. Now, you could say all the stories were coached, but at the same time, again, that's a lot of people. Now, if you had just 3 people or something, I could totally see that. But I feel like there was enough of a bad blood between Elizabeth and so many of the people who were supporting her and working with her that there just wasn't this incentive to say, oh, hey, you know, this is totally made up, this is total BS, whatever. This had some, because the best lies are those based in facts. So yes, she was not bathing in the blood of her victims, like we've all heard. However, she was torturing and killing young girls. That actually does make sense. What's also interesting to consider is that they didn't actually put her on trial. They just basically boarded her up and just said, we're going to forget about you. The reason is that her husband was a war hero. They could not put her on trial. And so even making allegations like this, especially because he participated in it and he taught her some of her techniques, and that was part of the testimony, they're kind of throwing their hands up going, oh man, we can't really put her on trial. We can't really execute her. She was the wife of a war hero. We still do, the people value him, and we don't want to disparage the troops or make them or diminish our own war efforts because Elizabeth. So there was just a lot of these confluing and conflicting interests going on. But at the end of this day, what I think happened is, yes, I do think Elizabeth probably did torture and kill a lot of her young female servants. I feel like that the narrative does make sense. Now, did she bathe in their blood? No, she did not. She did not, because it actually would take, believe it or not, 30 young girls to actually fill up a bathtub. So the likelihood of her bathing in their blood is incredibly, incredibly remote. However, Elizabeth was a woman of her times very much. She was raised in a very brutal time period. This was a lot of conflict, and those kind of things do have an impact. She spent most of her life guarding her properties against the Ottoman Turks. So there was a stress there. And then her husband was on the front lines, and she had a couple of her children die young. I mean, that wasn't unusual. So this was a woman who was dealing with a lot of stress during her life. So she enacted it out in this very shocking and horrific fashion. But that is how she became known as the Blood Countess, and her story and that of Vlad the Impaler. And I will say, actually, Bram Stoker did say that Vlad was an inspiration. We have no evidence that Elizabeth was. But I feel like since both of them are kind of from the same region and have that same history with Transylvania, that their stories themselves actually kind of feed the vampire narrative. Both of theirs do. I'm sure Bram heard something that was directly related in some sort of way to Elizabeth, because those rumors, those legends still existed in those areas. Everybody was very aware of who these two people were because they had such a stigma to them. They were so well aware of the violence, of the terror that these two names, these two people, Elizabeth and Vlad, could imperil on them. So guys, let me know what you think of this video, my first history one. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I truly enjoyed researching it, and honestly, I was really hoping to film this last night and edit it this evening, but I really enjoyed reading and learning more about it because I just wanted to know, okay, did she really do it or not? But guys, let me know what you think. Do you think this was an entire vast conspiracy against Elizabeth just to eliminate some debts and to eliminate her claim to a lot of her property and things? Or do you think she really was a sadistic torturer of young girls? What do you think, guys? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for tuning into this special Halloween episode. I look forward to seeing you again with more royal news very soon. Bye!